as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the North Carolina highway. Staff Sergeant James Miller steered his dusty blue Ford pickup into the isolated Wilson's gas station. Situated on the outskirts of Fort Bragg, the small station was nearly deserted, with its neon sign flickering weakly as night crept in. After 15 months in Afghanistan, even the simple sight of a typical American gas station seemed oddly unfamiliar to James. He pulled up to pump number 3, the sound of gravel crunching beneath his tires. His military fatigues were still sharp and spotless. He hadn't bothered to change since landing. His mind, focused solely on getting home, raced with thoughts of surprising his wife, Sarah, and their 6-year-old daughter, Emma. They hadn't expected him for another week, but a fortuitous early transport had brought him back ahead of schedule. The warm, humid air of late summer in North Carolina wrapped around him as he stepped out of his truck, the thud of his combat boots hitting the ground a grounding sound after the long drive from the airport. At 32, James appeared younger than his years, though his eyes revealed the toll of 3 combat tours. Inside his wallet, he found the crayon drawing Emma had sent him 2 months ago, carefully folded and protected from the harsh Afghan climate. The drawing depicted their family, 3 stick figures with wide smiles standing in front of their home. "Come home soon, Daddy," she had written in shaky letters. A soft smile tugged at James's lips as he thought, well, baby girl, Daddy's finally coming home. The station was quiet, the only other vehicle a solitary car parked near the entrance to the convenience store. Through the windows, James could see an elderly clerk reading a newspaper behind the counter. The calm, everyday scene felt almost surreal to James after months of wartime chaos, a peacefulness so normal it seemed out of place. As he inserted his credit card into the pump, his military training kicked in, an automatic awareness of his surroundings. Even in the midst of this normalcy, he couldn't help but assess everything. The security camera above the store entrance, the blind spots behind the ice machine, the clear sight lines to the highway. These assessments had kept him alive overseas, but here, they were just lingering habits from another life. As the pump clicked, signaling the tank was full, James's mind drifted back to the surprise he'd been planning for Sarah. He imagined her reaction. She would probably cry, as she always did during their reunions. Emma, at that perfect age where Dad was still her hero, would certainly rush into his arms. He regretted missing her birthday, but he hoped the small bear he had packed in his duffel bag, dressed in a miniature army uniform, would make up for it. The evening breeze brought the fresh scent of pine trees and the nearby aroma of barbecue, so different from the dusty air he'd been breathing for the last 15 months. A few crickets had begun their nightly chorus in the tall grass behind the station, and everything felt perfectly ordinary, yet strangely special. Checking his watch, James saw it was 7:45 p.m. If he drove straight through, he'd be home by 9:30. Sarah usually put Emma to bed around 8:30, but he knew his daughter would often talk her into reading just one more story. They would likely still be awake when he arrived. With a final glance at the pump, James returned the nozzle to its place and made a mental note to grab some water and maybe coffee for the remainder of the drive. The excitement of coming home early had kept him energized, but now, after the long flight and drive, exhaustion was beginning to set in. As he twisted the gas cap back on, the distant roar of motorcycles caught his attention. The sound grew louder, echoing through the trees surrounding the station. James's trained instincts kicked in. There was something about the harsh growl of the engines that set him on edge. He'd learned long ago to trust these feelings. Soon, 3 motorcycles appeared on the highway, their headlights slicing through the growing twilight. They turned into the station, engines growling, the deep rumble shattering the evening's stillness. The bikes were large, custom cruisers, gleaming with chrome and vibrant paint jobs. The riders were imposing figures, clad in leather vests adorned with patches. James stood tall, his face neutral, but alert as the bikers circled around to the far side of the pump station. James could feel their gaze lingering on him, sizing up his military uniform. Having faced countless hostile situations, he instantly sensed that the calm of the evening was about to be shattered. The bikers, unaware, were about to make the mistake of crossing paths with the wrong soldier. The three motorcycles circled the gas station, their engines growling like predatory beasts. Finally, they parked their bikes in a row, taking up more space than necessary near the entrance of the store. James kept them in his peripheral vision, maintaining a cool exterior, while his mind quickly assessed each rider. It was easy to spot the leader, a massive man, well over 6 feet tall, with a scraggly gray beard and arms adorned with faded tattoos. His leather vest bore a patch reading Road Devils NC, along with various other insignias that clearly identified him as the group's president. The other two bikers were smaller, but no less intimidating. One had a shaved head, and the other wore a bandana. As they dismounted, their heavy boots crunched on the gravel, and the creak of their leather gear filled the air. Their loud voices and exaggerated laughter were accompanied by obvious glances in James's direction. The soldier continued with his task, wiping his hands on a paper towel after finishing with the gas pump. He dealt with their type before, bullies looking for trouble. Well, what do we have here?" the leader called out, his voice deliberately loud, carrying across the quiet station. "Looks like one of Uncle Sam's toy soldiers decided to grace us with his presence." His companions snickered on cue like extras in a bad movie. James turned slightly, giving them a brief nod, but offering no further response. He'd learned in Afghanistan that sometimes the best defense was to deny potential enemies the engagement they craved. But the bikers weren't backing off. The leader, whose friends called him Bear, began to approach James, walking in an intentionally erratic manner, like a predator closing in on its prey. "Hey, boys," he announced loudly. "Maybe we should thank him for his service?" His voice was laced with thick sarcasm, and as Bear drew closer, James could smell the pungent mix of cigarettes and cheap beer on his breath. The biker used his imposing size to invade James's personal space, standing too close for comfort. James stood still, his muscles relaxed but coiled, like a spring waiting to release. "You know what I think about the military?" Bear growled, now almost nose to nose with James. "I think you guys just play dress up and waste our tax dollars." With that, he deliberately bumped his shoulder into James as he passed, heading toward the store entrance. The other two bikers followed suit, each one making sure to shove past James as they moved. The one with the bandana spat on the ground near James's boots, while the bald one muttered something about government puppets. Through it all, James remained perfectly still. His face gave away nothing, but his mind was cataloging every little detail. He noted how Bear favored his right leg slightly, a subtle hint of an old injury. The bald one kept his left hand near his belt, perhaps concealing a weapon. The biker with the bandana seemed the most jittery, his nervous energy making him the most unpredictable. Inside the store, the elderly clerk observed the situation unfold with growing concern, having seen trouble begin this way before. His hand inched closer to the foam gun behind the counter, ready for any sudden action. The fluorescent lights above buzzed, casting an unflattering glow on the scene as Bear and his friends entered the store. The bell above the door jingled, marking their entrance. James realized he needed to grab water and coffee for the rest of his drive home, which meant he'd have to go into the store as well. He took a slow, deep breath, the same way he did before leading his unit on patrol. The peaceful evening he had once enjoyed had vanished, replaced by a familiar tension. As James walked toward the store entrance, his thoughts were consumed by his wife and daughter, waiting for him at home. He had no desire for confrontation. He'd witnessed enough violence to last several lifetimes. Yet 15 months spent in a war zone had taught him that trouble doesn't always wait for an invitation. Sometimes it finds you whether you want it or not. The bell above the door chimed as James entered, and he immediately felt the tension in the air shift. The convenience store's fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a sterile glow over the space. The cool air from the AC hit his face, a welcome relief from the sticky warmth of the evening outside. Behind the counter, the elderly clerk, Frank, watched James and the bikers warily. Frank had run this store for over 30 years, and he could smell trouble from miles away. Bear and his two companions were already causing a ruckus. They had spread out across the store, knocking items off shelves as they moved carelessly. The bald one, Spike, stood near the coffee machine, deliberately blocking anyone from accessing it. Snake, the biker with the bandana, was slamming the cooler doors open and shut with exaggerated force. James moved methodically towards the water section, maintaining a sharp awareness of his surroundings. Years of military experience had taught him how to track multiple threats while appearing calm and collected. Even though he wasn't looking directly at them, he could feel Bear's eyes on him, watching for any sign of weakness, any hint of aggression. "Hey, soldier boy," Bear called out, his voice echoing in the confined space. "You think you're some kind of hero?" He picked up a bag of chips, squeezed it so hard that it crumpled in his hand, and then dropped it back on the shelf with a thud. "My cousin joined the army, came back in a box. What do you think about that?" James reached for a bottle of water, his movements deliberate and controlled. He knew Bear was trying to provoke him, hoping for any excuse to escalate the situation. It was an old tactic: create a scene, provoke a response, and then claim self-defense when it all went wrong. "Can't even answer a simple question?" Snake chimed in, slamming another cooler door with unnecessary force. "Maybe they don't teach manners in the army anymore." His laughter was high-pitched and discordant, a stark contrast to his tough guy demeanor. Frank, the clerk, had served in Vietnam. He recognized the look in James's eyes, the calm focus of a man who had seen real combat, not just drunken bar brawls. His hand hovered near the phone, ready to dial the police if things took a turn for the worse. James moved toward the coffee station, but Spike didn't budge. "Excuse me," James said calmly, the first words he had spoken since entering the store. His voice was steady and professional, the tone of someone used to giving orders. "What's that?" Spike mocked, cupping his ear. Did the toy soldier say something? He pretended to pour himself a cup of coffee, deliberately spilling it on the floor. "Oops. Looks like there's been a spill. Better call in the military to clean it up." Bear walked over, his heavy boots leaving dirty marks on the freshly mopped floor as he positioned himself next to Spike. The two men created a wall of leather and muscle, effectively blocking James from the coffee machine. Bear stood close, his voice low and threatening. "You know what I think?" he growled, standing so close that James could count the gray hairs in his beard. "I think you military types think you're better than everyone else. Walking around in your fancy uniforms, expecting people to bow down and thank you." James remained silent, his eyes forward, but his muscles were coiled, ready. Years of training had taught him how to handle close-quarters combat, how to take on multiple opponents in tight spaces. But he also knew that the best fight is the one you avoid. Snake had now positioned himself behind James, completing the triangle of intimidation. "Maybe we should teach him some respect," he said, cracking his knuckles for effect. The sound echoed in the small store like firecrackers. Frank, who had witnessed enough bar fights and street brawls in his time, could feel the tension building. This was reaching a breaking point. His fingers hovered nervously over the phone, ready to call for help if things got worse. Then, Bear made his fatal mistake. Reaching out with his large hand, he grabbed hold of the American flag patch on James's uniform. "What's this worth to you, soldier boy?" Bear sneered, starting to pull at the patch. "Let's see how tough you really are." In that moment, the air in the store seemed to freeze. James's eyes slowly shifted from the coffee machine to Bear's face. Something shifted in those eyes, a switch being flipped from passive observer to a trained warrior. The tension had reached its peak, and James was ready for whatever came next. The three bikers had crossed a line they couldn't undo. Time seemed to slow in the bright, buzzing convenience store as Bear's hand clenched around the American flag patch on James's uniform. Frank, the elderly clerk, immediately noticed the shift in the soldier's posture. Something subtle, but unmistakable. His veteran instincts kicked in. It was as if he were watching a lion pretending to sleep suddenly stir and prepare to strike. "You know what else I hate about you military types?" Bear continued, completely oblivious to the danger surrounding him. He yanked at the flag patch again, hearing the threads start to snap. "You come back here thinking you're some kind of heroes. What's so heroic about dropping bombs from the sky?" "Huh." James stood motionless, his mind racing back to the men he had lost overseas. He thought about Private Jenkins, who had stepped on an IED while shielding a school. Sergeant Rhee, who had taken a bullet while carrying a civilian child to safety. And Captain Thompson, who had sacrificed himself to save his entire unit. Snake moved in closer, encouraged by James's silence. "Maybe he's scared," he taunted, reaching out to poke James in the back. "Not so tough without your whole army behind you, are you?" Spike laughed, the sound harsh and grating as it bounced off the store's windows. "Hey Bear, maybe we should take his uniform as a souvenir. Make a nice Halloween costume, don't you think?" As Spike reached for James's sleeve, his fingers slick with dirt and grease. That's when Bear made his fatal mistake. He spat on the floor right next to James's polished boots and, with a sneer, muttered the words that sealed his fate. "Your dead military buddies are probably better off that way. At least they don't have to pretend to be heroes anymore." The fluorescent lights overhead flickered as James finally moved. He slowly turned his head and looked Bear directly in the eyes. Frank, watching from behind the counter, could feel a chill in the air as the soldier's face transformed. Not with rage, but with a cold, professional focus. The kind of calm that sent a shiver down Frank's spine. "I've seen guys like you before," James said, his voice quiet but cutting through the store clearly. "In every country I've served in, there are always bullies who mistake kindness for weakness." His words were calm, deliberate, like a report being given. Bear blinked, a flash of uncertainty crossing his face. James's tone had shifted something in the atmosphere, causing the biker to loosen his grip on the flag patch for the first time. His eyes flicked to the combat ribbons on James's chest, the Special Forces badge, the Ranger tab. The realization hit him hard, and his expression faltered. He had misjudged the situation. "You better watch your mouth, soldier boy," Snake warned, though his voice wavered slightly. The change in the air was palpable, like the pressure drop before a storm. James's movements were slow but deliberate as he reached up and removed Bear's hand from his uniform. His grip was firm, controlled, and much stronger than the biker had anticipated. "I'm going to give you one chance," James said quietly. "Walk away now. Get on your bikes and leave." Spike, still trying to salvage their tough guy act, stepped forward aggressively. "Or what? There's 3 of us and 1 of you. What do you think you're going to do?" James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he locked eyes with each of the bikers, his gaze unwavering. It was the same look he had worn in Kandahar. Unimpressed, calm, and undeterred by the bravado of playground bullies. "Last chance," James said, his voice steady and cold. "Walk away." Pride stung deep in Bear, and in that moment, he made a decision that he would regret for months to come. His massive fist drew back, the muscles in his arm flexing under his leather vest. "Get him," he growled to his friends. Frank's hand hovered over the phone, but he knew it was already too late. The police wouldn't be able to prevent what was about to happen. The old veteran muttered a quiet prayer, not for the soldier, but for the 3 bikers who had just made the worst mistake of their lives. Bear's fist swiped through the air, missing James by mere inches as the soldier dodged with startling speed. He moved quickly, stepping just inside Bear's reach, knocking the biker off balance before he could even react. By the time Bear regained his footing, James was already in a combat stance, feet grounded, hands at the ready, eyes sharply alert. Bear's words were cut off as James smoothly executed an arm lock, the same technique he had drilled over and over during close-quarters combat training. In an instant, the large biker was sent stumbling forward, his own momentum betraying him. Snake and Spike, seeing their leader falter, rushed in from different angles, thinking their numbers would overwhelm the soldier. What they didn't understand was that they were facing someone with Special Forces training, a man who had spent years honing the ability to handle multiple threats in tight spaces. Their street fighting instincts were no match for military precision. James flowed like water, sidestepping Snake's wild punch and using the biker's own momentum to send him crashing into a display of chips. In the same smooth motion, he blocked Spike's grab, using the biker's forward motion to throw him off balance. Frank, the elderly clerk, watched in stunned silence from behind the counter. In his days in Vietnam, he had seen soldiers fight before, but this was something entirely different. James wasn't fighting with rage or violence. He was controlling the situation with meticulous efficiency, as if playing a game of chess, thinking several moves ahead. "There," recovering quickly, roared and charged once again, like a wild animal. James met the charge with textbook combat technique, stepping aside just enough to use Bear's momentum against him. With precise pressure on the biker's elbow and shoulder, James brought the massive man crashing to the floor before he could even process what had happened. Snake, scrambling to his feet, pulled a small knife from his belt, its blade gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. "You're dead now, soldier boy," he sneered, slashing wildly. James's response was swift and decisive. Years of combat training kicked in as he expertly deflected the knife, trapped Snake's wrist, and applied pressure. The knife dropped to the floor with a clatter as Snake howled in pain, his arm locked in a hold that could easily break with just a bit more force. Meanwhile, Spike attempted to attack from behind, but James had been tracking his movements through the reflection in the store's window. Dropping his center of gravity, James used Snake's trapped arm as leverage, sending both bikers tumbling over one another like bowling pins. Bear, still seething with rage and humiliation, started to rise. James turned to face him, calm as ever. "Stay down," he advised, his voice steady and unthreatened. "You don't want this to continue." But Bear wasn't listening. With a roar, he charged forward, throwing a powerful punch that would have floored any average person. James slipped the punch effortlessly, stepping inside Bear's guard and performing a flawless hip throw. For a split second, the giant biker was airborne before crashing hard onto his back, the force knocking all the breath out of him. In less than 30 seconds, the confrontation was over. Three tough bikers lay groaning and dazed on the floor, while James stood calmly in the center of the store, the picture of composure. Not a single item on the shelves had been knocked over, except for the chip rack Snake had crashed into. Frank noticed with surprise that James hadn't thrown a single punch. Every move had been defensive, designed to neutralize the threats without causing harm. This wasn't street violence. It was military efficiency in its purest form. "The police are on their way," Frank announced, his hand still on the phone. He could hear the distant sirens growing louder. James straightened his uniform, casting a glance at the fallen bikers. "Next time," he said quietly, his tone measured, "think twice before you disrespect the flag or the soldiers who died defending it." Red and blue lights flashed through the store windows as two police cars pulled into the gas station. The evening air was filled with the sound of tires crunching over gravel, followed by the brief wail of a siren. Frank had already pulled up the security footage on the store's outdated computer system, while James, undisturbed, stood near the coffee machine, finally pouring himself that much-needed cup. Officer Sarah Martinez, a seasoned cop with 15 years on the force, was the first to step through the door. Officer Martinez stepped into the store, immediately surveying the scene with practiced eyes. Three bikers sprawled on the floor, a scattered chip display, and a soldier calmly adding cream to his coffee. "Good evening, ma'am," James greeted politely, his military bearing evident in his posture. "I apologize for the disturbance." Bear, still nursing his pride more than his body, was slowly sitting up. Snake and Spike struggled to untangle themselves from one another, their leather jackets creaking with every movement. The knife that Snake had pulled earlier now lay harmlessly on the floor, an unspoken reminder of the escalation. Frank, already on the phone, called in the situation. Officer Martinez turned her attention to James. "I heard something about three bikers causing trouble with a soldier," she said. Her partner, Officer Thompson, was already checking on the fallen bikers to ensure none of them needed immediate medical care. "That's correct," James replied, his tone steady and professional. "These gentlemen had an issue with my uniform. When words failed, I was forced to defend myself." His explanation was as clear and concise as a mission report. Frank shuffled over to Officer Martinez, still holding his phone. "Got it all on here," he said proudly. "These boys started it." The soldier gave them every chance to walk away. The officers reviewed the footage, their eyebrows rising as they watched James handle the situation with surprising efficiency. "Special Forces?" Officer Martinez asked, noticing the patches on his uniform. "Yes, ma'am," James replied. "Staff Sergeant James Miller. Just returned from Afghanistan." Bear was now slowly rising to his feet, his large frame swaying slightly. "We want to press charges," he demanded, though his voice lacked the earlier confidence. "They attacked us?" Officer Thompson glanced up from his notepad. "Sir," he said, his tone neutral, "the footage clearly shows you through the first punch." He paused, then added, "Picking up Snake's knife and bringing a weapon into the situation changes things. It's a whole different ball game now." Snake's face turned pale. He had a record, and bringing a knife to a fight would violate his parole. Spike, now sitting on the floor, stared at his boots, the bravado drained from him. Officer Martinez addressed the group with authority. "Here's what's going to happen. We'll take statements from everyone, but based on the footage and the witness testimony, this is clearly self-defense." She turned to the bikers. "You three, however, are coming down to the station." As the officers began reading the writs and taking statements, Frank approached James with a fresh cup of coffee. "This one's on the house, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Reminds me of something that happened in '69 outside Saigon." James listened attentively as Frank shared a brief war story, recognizing the bond between soldiers that spanned across generations. The old veteran's eyes grew misty as he talked about his homecoming, a stark contrast to the one James would now experience in today's world. More patrol cars had arrived, and the officers were running the bikers' IDs, discovering outstanding warrants for Bear and a parole violation for Snake. Their tough guy act had crumbled in the face of real consequences. Officer Martinez approached James once more. "You handled that situation perfectly, Sergeant," she said, admiration clear in her voice. "Minimal force, no serious injuries, and clear self-defense. You're free to go. Welcome home." James nodded, gathering his coffee and water, preparing to leave. As he walked past the bikers, now handcuffed, Bear couldn't meet his eyes. The massive biker had learned a hard lesson about judging others by their appearance rather than their true capabilities. Frank watched James head for the door. "Hey, Sergeant," he called out, "next time you're passing through, the coffee's always free for you." Back at the police station, Bear, Snake, and Spike sat in separate interview rooms, their tough exteriors shattered. Detective Roberts, a seasoned 20-year veteran, reviewed their records on his computer screen, shaking his head in disbelief. "So, you're telling me," he said to Bear, whose real name turned out to be Stanley Thompson, "that you thought it was a good idea to pick a fight with a Special Forces soldiers?" The detective's voice was a mix of amusement and disappointment. Bear slumped in his chair, his massive shoulders drooping. His leather vest had been confiscated as evidence, revealing a faded Led Zeppelin t-shirt underneath, making him appear surprisingly ordinary. "We didn't know he was Special Forces," he mumbled. In the next room, Snake faced his parole officer, Mrs. Jenkins, a stern woman who had seen it all. "A knife?" she asked, her voice sharp with disapproval. "You brought a knife to a fistfight at a gas station? Do you understand what this means for your parole?" Meanwhile, back at Wilson's gas station, the evening had returned to its usual quiet rhythm. Frank was busy putting the chip display back together, but kept pausing to rewatch the security footage on his phone, each time replaying the surprising sequence of events. James proudly showed the security footage to a customer, his voice full of pride, as though he'd been directly involved. "See that move right there?" he'd say, pointing to the screen. "That's what we were taught in Vietnam." "Well, not that smooth, but similar." The customer would gather around, watching in awe as James effortlessly neutralized 3 attackers without ever landing a punch. News vans soon began arriving at the station. The tale of a Special Forces soldier defending himself against 3 bikers was too good to ignore. Lisa Chun from Channel 7 interviewed Frank, who eagerly recounted the events, giving a colorful play-by-play. "It was like watching a dance," Frank told the camera, his hands gesturing animatedly. "These 3 big guys thought they had him cornered. But that soldier? He moved like water. Reminded me of my buddy Martinez back in '69. Meanwhile, at the police station, Officer Martinez was wrapping up her report. The charges against the bikers were stacking up. Attempted assault, carrying a concealed weapon, parole violation, and a slew of outstanding warrants. She couldn't help but smile at how a simple act of bullying had led to their downfall. In the break room, officers huddled around a laptop watching the security footage that had already circulated among law enforcement. "That's how you handle multiple attackers," the department's self-defense instructor commented, admiring the textbook perfect techniques. Snake's knife was logged as evidence, and the weapon would add a minimum of 6 months to his sentence. Spike, whose real name was Timothy Parker, called his wife, his voice drowned out by her angry shouts coming through the phone. The incident was quickly spreading on social media, with people from both the veteran and civilian communities praising James's restraint and skill. Frank's phone hadn't stopped ringing, as old military friends called after recognizing the gas station on the news. They exchanged stories of their own experiences, and Frank, feeling the warmth of nostalgia, proudly recounted how he'd known trouble was brewing the moment those bikers pulled up. As the night shift took over at the police station, Detective Roberts compiled the final statements. The bikers would face a judge in the morning, their reputations forever tarnished in the local biker community. Their intimidating road devils patches now sat stuffed in evidence bags. Officer Martinez pinned the last photos to her case board, 3 mug shots that revealed faces more embarrassed than injured, alongside the gas station security camera shots that captured the perfect sequence showing how training and discipline had triumphed over brute force. At 10:15 p.m., James finally pulled into his driveway. The porch light was on, and through the window, he saw Sarah sitting on the couch, reading. Though the events at the gas station had delayed his homecoming by almost an hour, seeing his home in the quiet of the night made everything feel less significant. Across town, the story of the gas station confrontation was spreading quickly through the local veteran community. At the VFW Post 2876, veterans crowded around phones and tablets, watching the viral video. The old-timers nodded in approval, recognizing the calm and disciplined response that could only come from years of military training. "That's the difference between real training and bar fights," said retired Master Sergeant Wilson, pointing at the screen. "No shouting, no macho nonsense, just pure efficiency." Back at the county jail, Snake and Spike sat in separate holding cells, each lost in his own thoughts. Bear, his hands that had once intimidated so many, stared at them, now realizing how ineffective they had been in the face of real combat training. The tough guy image he'd built over the years had crumbled in seconds at the hands of a soldier who hadn't even thrown a punch. Frank closed up the gas station for the night, but not before putting up a new sign behind the counter: "Veterans always welcome." Free coffee. He carefully stored the security footage on a personal USB drive, knowing it would become a regular feature at his weekly veterans breakfast meetings. The local newspaper was already preparing its morning headline: "Special Forces Soldier Shows Restraint in Gas Station Confrontation." The article would highlight not the fight itself, but how military training emphasized control and de-escalation over violence. Back at James's house, as he walked up the pathway, the front door suddenly swung open. His 6-year-old daughter, Emma, who was supposed to be in bed, came running toward him in her pajamas. "Daddy," she screamed, leaping into his arms. Sarah appeared in the doorway, tears already streaming down her face. James held his daughter and kissed his wife. The events at the gas station felt like a distant memory now. Emma, touching the flag patch on his uniform, the same one Bear had tried to disrespect, proudly said, "My daddy's a soldier." The next morning, at Fort Bragg, James's commander received multiple emails praising his soldiers' conduct. The security footage had made its way through military channels, and instructors were already planning to use it as a training example for proper threat management and the use of minimal force. Meanwhile, the Road Devils MC held an emergency meeting to discuss the incident. By unanimous vote, they expelled Bear, Snake, and Spike from their ranks. The club president made it clear that disrespecting veterans would never be tolerated and that the trio had shamed their organization. A week later, Frank hosted his regular veterans breakfast at the gas station. The small store was packed with former service members from various eras: Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. They swapped stories, drank free coffee, and discussed how military training had shaped their lives long after their service ended. Officer Martinez stopped by during her morning patrol, having added the gas station security footage to the police academy's training materials. It was now used to demonstrate how proper training and self-control could defuse dangerous situations without excessive force. As for the three bikers, their court date loomed. The weight of their actions hung over them, not just in the form of legal consequences, but in the lessons they had learned about judging others. Bear, facing the longest sentence due to prior warrants, wrote a letter of apology to the military base, expressing regret for disrespecting the uniform and those who wore it. The story of the confrontation became a local legend, shared at barbershops, diners, and veterans meetings. It wasn't a tale of violence or revenge, but one of discipline, training, and the quiet strength that true warriors possess. It served as a reminder that real heroes don't seek out fights, but they certainly know how to end them.